Hello everyone, this is a walkthrough through the Section 1 ACER Orange 2nd edition booklet. For copyright reasons, we cannot reproduce the passages, the questions or the answers in full here, so please keep your copy of the booklet open as you follow this video. And without further ado, let's move on to question 1. We are asked to consider Lucas Foss's attitude to theory, and this word theory here is key because he does actually discuss some important differences between theory and practice in this passage. So in order to get this question right, you have to focus on the word theory. The most direct way at getting at the correct answer here, which is B, is by looking at some very obvious giveaways in the text. Now we know the two are inseparable because Foss writes things like dividing them is dividing something indivisible. It is dividing an indivisible whole. We also see that he says that this division is as nonsensical as dividing form from content and so on. So we have enough evidence to say B because they're inseparable. However, if we had any doubt, we could also get to the same answer by eliminating the other options. And let's do that. Throughout the passage, Foss doesn't really try to establish a hierarchy. Does he suggest that performance is below somehow in a hierarchy? Is it below composition? Well, he talks about performers very respectfully and refers to virtuoso performers and hand-picking performers and so on. So there isn't really any suggestion that he looks down on performing at all. He also doesn't really elevate performance above composition. In fact, if we look here in the first paragraph, he talks about performance and composition being like two halves of a worm. So it's two halves, right? It's not 1/3 and 2/3 or any other division. It's halves, which would suggest that he sees them as pretty equal. So why isn't it D then? Well, it is an okay answer, and as often happens in GAMSAT. It's not necessarily that every answer is completely and utterly wrong, right? Some are, most are, but quite often you will come across a case where you've got two answers, both of which are kind of okay, and then you struggle to pick the correct one, in which case you always need to go back to the question, what is his theory about performance and composition? Now, if you read this passage and then you were to relate to somebody, what does Foss think about composition and performance? You would not say that they are equal. I mean, you might say that and you wouldn't be wrong, but that really wouldn't capture the essence of what Foss is saying here. What he is saying is that they are two parts of an indivisible whole, and he actually uses the word indivisible, and that's why B is your best answer. Question 2 asks us about the creative investigation that Foss talks about. What does this creative investigation actually consist of? There are some options that we can discard straight away here. For instance, D is out of the question because it is not mentioned anywhere that performers are unhappy and are asking composers to be more sympathetic to their needs. That is just not mentioned anywhere. We can discard that straight away. Performers exploring different ways to compose. I think that would be far-fetched. That would be reading quite a lot into it. So once again, no. We are then left with A and C, and the two are close enough together that it's one of those questions that would make us slightly uncomfortable. I certainly hesitated between A and C when I came across it. He does talk about composers exploring performance together, but his claim is stronger than that. he is talking about composers working with quote-unquote hand-picked performers in order to improve composition. So that is going one above, looking at different ways of performing. Therefore, C is the correct option. Question 3 is a classic design of a GAMSAT Section 1 question, in that there are 2 options that you can discard straight away, and then you can sort of agonize between the other 2. So the options that you can discard straight away are B and C, because both of those options are saying that the separation of composition and performance are something bad. That is in direct opposition to what Beethoven is saying with his rather strongly worded quote. He's basically saying there is a gulf, there is an abyss between composition and performance, and that is as it should be. So B and C are entirely in opposition to that, and therefore we can discard them straight away. Now D is a fairly easy mistake to make. How do we interpret Beethoven's reference to his silly fiddle? We could interpret it as saying this performer is bad at playing his fiddle. I mean, even the word fiddle is derogatory, isn't it, really, compared to violin. We could interpret it as a criticism of the performer's mastery of his instrument. However, that is not actually what Beethoven is saying here. If that was what he were saying, then Voss may not have used this as a quote. The reason Beethoven insults the fiddle and insults the practical playing of the fiddle is because Beethoven considers composing to be way above, way more highbrow. He practically says, the gods are talking to me when I compose, so I will not condescend so low as to discuss your playing of your silly fiddle. Therefore, the best, by far the closest answer is A, and that is that performing is irrelevant to the high art of composition as Beethoven saw it. And this is a key point in question 3, because in question 3 we are asked to shift from considering Voss's view to considering Beethoven's view. And that is key. That is something that a lot of people get caught out in. When you read a question, read it carefully. Ask yourself, whose viewpoint is it that I am being asked to consider here? Because here we are no longer in the world of Voss, we are in the world of Beethoven, and in fact the two don't see eye to eye on the question of composing and performance. Question 4, we are asked to return to Voss's perspective and consider the reference to a hand-picked performer. What sort of qualities does this hand-picked performer possess? This is a challenging question because it is a question of inference. I have not been able to find any direct, explicit answers to this question within the text, so it is a matter more of scanning the text and seeing what we can extract from the subtext, from what is said and what is not said. So there's a bit of textual guesswork involved. Another thing that really helps with a question like that is just going through the options and seeing if any of them seem completely improbable and can be discarded, leaving us with fewer options to consider. The first option I would discard is B, with the reference to the silly fiddle. So this is saying a hand-picked performer is a performer that can play the fiddle or their instrument very well. That is hopefully the case if you're working with a composer, but it is not what Voss is getting at. We are not talking here of the technical mastery of the performer. Presumably that would be a necessary condition to be handpicked by a composer, but not a sufficient one. There is something else that Voss is getting at. So B is out of the question. Now, option C, the phrasing work quickly and independently should make you suspicious here, because we are talking about teamwork between performer and composer after all. So the word independently put me on my guard straight away, as did the word quickly, because there is no suggestion of speed. However, the question does contain a red herring, which is toward a common goal, which is a verbatim quote from the text itself. So be careful of cases like that. We are then left with A and D. Does the hand-picked performer have a good understanding of the basic elements of composition? It is probably desirable, but again, it is not the essence of what Foss is looking for. In D, however, there is also a wordplay. They are being a little bit facetious here by saying a composition, an understanding of a composition that concurs with that of the composer. Now, composition without the A would refer to the act of composing, the process of composing, and a composition would refer to the product of that act, a musical composition. So pay attention to that A, because of course it changes the meaning of the entire option D. So the correct answer is D, because the performer would be hand-picked by the composer, because they would have a similar feel, a similar intuitive understanding of this composition that they are working on together with the composer. Something that really convinced me of the fact that this is the correct option is the reference to the two halves of a worm proceeding obliviously on their course without each other. The synergy, communal cognition, shared cognition between composer and performer. Question 5 of Unit 1 is comparatively straightforward, because it is quite easy to see why the incorrect options are incorrect. It's very easy to go through the process of elimination in order to arrive at the correct option. Does Foss say that the division between composition and performance has outlived its usefulness? He does not. So he very clearly states in line 11 that this division will remain with us because the practical advantages of the division are too great. So you can see how that renders all the wrong options wrong straight away. It is not a mistake which was only tolerated because. He's saying it is still tolerated because even though it may be conceptually a mistake, it has a lot of practical usefulness. So D is out of the question. B is out of the question. Let's look at C, the conceptualization. He is saying the opposite of that. He's saying conceptually it is a ridiculous division. However, when it comes to actually practicing music, creating music, performing music in practice, it serves as a useful distinction, but it is a distinction that in theory is a ridiculous one. Therefore, A is your correct answer. We're now going to move on to passage 2. Question 6 asks us to figure out where Foss would consider it would be safe to leave a notation incomplete. And this is quite an easy question because Foss gives us the answer early on. He says in line 1 that he is a bit of a control freak. He really doesn't like giving his performers a lot of freedom in interpreting his compositions. C is by far the best fit. There is no ambiguity. So where the way to perform something is unambiguous, that's where Foss feels more or less comfortable, leaving the notation less precise than he usually would. In all other respects, as he himself says, he really feels more comfortable giving as many instructions as possible. Other options are fairly easy to discard because they all contain something that is not mentioned in the text. D is talking about the performer's expertise. Now, neither passage 1 nor passage 2 talk about performer's expertise, performer's mastery of anything at all. Yet the options, the wrong options, keep inserting those ideas in there, so that's there to mislead you. B, about sounds not produced by a musical instrument, is definitely not mentioned anywhere in the text, and neither is C, any kind of special effects that fall outside the remit of conventional notation. So therefore C is our only viable answer. Question 7 in Unit 1 is an interesting question because it asks us to analyze a metaphor. The metaphor in question is one of a racehorse and the horseman holding the racehorse's reins. We are asked to consider what that means for the performer's task. The most informative place in this passage, the one that really provides the answer, is in lines 11 and 12, where Voss says that there is a paradox in playing a piece of music well, in that it involves following the directions and the intention of the composer so closely that somehow paradoxically, therein lies the paradox, you develop your own style of performance. And that is the tension that excellent performers manage. There is an inherent contradiction between following the composer exactly and developing your own style, and yet Voss says this is what virtuoso performers achieve. So in the metaphor of the racehorse and the horseman is the composer and the racehorse is the performer, but a good performer kind of gets into the composer's head. She manages also to be the horseman holding the reins. So a good performer at once performs following the instructions and identifies fully with the composer, with the person giving those instructions. So this is the duality, the dual effort that Voss speaks of. And therefore the correct answer is B, the performer being at one with the composer's intentions. C would be antithetical to what Voss is saying. Voss would hate the performer to take command because by his own admission he doesn't like giving performers a lot of freedom with his compositions. D refers to a superb facility. Again, this is that reference to technical mastery. That is not what Voss is talking about. And A, being in full control of the performance, is perhaps the closest alternative. We would hope that a good performer is in full control of the performance, but it is not the best and not the closest answer. It is not an answer that grasps at the essence of what Voss is saying. So the correct answer is therefore B. Question 8 is a delectable question because it is so satisfying to get right. It is asking us to sum up the relationship between composer and performer in Voss's view, and we can at once discard D because it suggests that composer and performer kind of merge into one. And that is obviously a red herring because in passage 1, the composer does talk about them being parts of an indivisible whole, and yet each of these parts functions separately, as is evident in passage 2. Voss still very much insists on the performer following his instructions. The composer is still primary in the ideas department, if you like. So while they are parts of an indivisible whole, they do not merge, they do not blend. They each have a specific function. The performer interpreting the composer's intention once again runs counter to Voss's idea of the performer bringing the composer's vision to life. So he says, I am one of the most reluctant composers I know when it comes to letting performers interpret my work as they see fit. He doesn't like that idea. And then B, finally, composer being inspired by the performance. I mean, this turns the process on its head. At no point in the text is there a suggestion that performance inspires the composer to compose. There is a suggestion of a performer and composer working together towards the end of passage 1, but there isn't a description of the process ordering it in this way, so that would be reading too much into the question. So option C, composer and performer working together, is the correct answer, because it mentions that the composer's intention still comes out top. It is still the primary remit of the composer to define what the composition will look like and sound like. And then the performer has their part to play.